So this has come as a massive surprise.
Officials admit they were caught by surprise earlier this month.
That's a strategic surprise.
That said, yes, I'm surprised.
The Obama administration is deeply concerned about the apparent loss of Mosul.
What's happened in Mosul was a shock for us.
I can't believe the militants took Mosul.
He said he was truly shocked by what had happened in Mosul.
The sudden advance by the Islamist rebels has shocked the region.
500,000 people have been forced to leave Mosul.
They captured vast stocks of weapons, weaponry, and armored vehicles.
2 million people fell to just 1,300 Sunni rebels.
The lightning speed of their conquest has shocked the government here and in Washington.
We're panicking because of what happened in Mosul, the shock of it.
In June of 2014, a force of fewer than 1,000 lightly armed jihadi militants shocked the world by racing across the Iraqi desert, attacking a seemingly far superior garrison of Iraqi soldiers, and seizing control of the second largest city in Iraq. In the time since, the creation of this first world city of terror has been widely dismissed as inexplicable. But as the jihadis have used the city's enormous wealth to pump violence and poisonous ideology around Iraq and the world, the true shape of the story has slowly come into focus. The terrible and mundane historical forces that led to Mosul's fall are the same that have been directing its fortunes since the very beginning. In all likelihood, they're the forces that will dictate its future as well. The city of Mosul has existed for thousands of years. Straddling the Tigris at a crucial midpoint between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea, it has fertile lands and a highly defensible countryside. But it's the city's power as a trading center that most shapes its early destiny. The ancient Babylonian and Assyrian empires keep a tight hold over the area from the beginnings of history. And in 650 BC, the Assyrians choose a modern-day suburb of Mosul to host the empire's capital. The lucrative river gate is subject to 1,000 years of invasions by Turkish, Persian, and even Mongol armies. But the 600 CE sees the rise of the Prophet Muhammad and widespread Islamic conquest. After Muhammad's death, a schism over inheritance of power produces two main sects of his new religion, Sunni and Shia Islam. From the beginning, the Sunni religion dominates the Muslim population, and throughout history, the Persian empires of Iran remain the sole major Shia power in the world. Mosul lies near the interface between the Sunni Ottoman empires and the Shia Persian empires, setting the stage for hundreds of years of strife. During the 11th and 12th centuries, Mosul serves as a major staging area for the Muslim side of the Crusades. Combined with a brutal cull of Assyrian Christians in the 1400s, this shifts the area toward being predominantly Arab and Muslim, with notable populations of stateless peoples like the Kurds and the Jews. Eventually, the Ottoman Turkish Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent turns back the Iranian Empire, creating a new caliphate that encompasses all the major cities of Sunni Islam, including Jerusalem, Damascus, Mecca, Medina, Cairo, and Baghdad. Around the same time, an ultra-conservative revivalist movement springs up in Arabia under a rural imam named Muhammad al-Wahhab. His Wahhabi doctrine preaches perfect adherence to the teachings and even the medieval lifestyle of the Prophet, in particular the incitements to conquest and violent conversion of infidels, including less observant Sunni Muslims. The Ottomans battled these more extremist forces for hundreds of years throughout Arabia, remaining mostly dominant, and keeping their extremism from entering Mesopotamia. The Ottomans' version of the Sunni religion comes to define most of the ethnicities of what will become northern Iraq, while Persia's Shia Islam remains dominant further to the south. Eventually, Mosul becomes the center of its own Ottoman province, giving it several hundred years of safety and prosperity, and allowing it to maintain a diverse population of Arabs, Assyrians, Kurds, Turkmen, and many small minorities. Several hundred years later, this ends with the outbreak of the First World War. The Ottomans managed to hold Mosul throughout the fighting, but by the end of the war, French and British troops have advanced all the way to Mesopotamia. The defeated Ottomans sign an armistice to end the Middle Eastern theater of the war, splitting the once great Sunni Empire according to European interests.
Are you sure you haven't heard of the Sykes-Picot Treaty?
No. I can guess.
Don't guess. Tell him.
Mr. Sykes is an English civil servant. Monsieur Picot is a French civil servant. Mr. Sykes and Monsieur Picot met, and they agreed that after the war, France and England should share the Turkish Empire.
According to these new Sykes-Picot borders, Mosul should go to a new French-controlled area that will go on to become Turkey. Immediately after signing the agreement, however, the British simply marched troops into Mosul anyway. With the Ottomans still recovering from a crushing defeat, no opposition is possible. Mosul, a Sunni-majority city, now falls within the borders of a new Shia-majority state called Iraq, not Sunni-majority Turkey. Expanding Iraq's borders north also ensures that a geographically unified nation of Kurds will now be split between 4 new countries, with competing ambitions. Over the ensuing 20 years, however, this British gamble pays off, as Mosul's enormous oil reservoirs become a source of increasing wealth and power. To the south, most of the Arabian Peninsula is given over to the Ottomans' old fundamentalist rivals, Wahhabi Sunnis following a line of theocratic kings, the House of Saud. Like Iraq, this new Saudi kingdom will turn out to have some of the largest oil reserves in the world, and the immense wealth allows them to bring the historically isolated and medieval Wahhabi ideology to unprecedented global prominence. In Iraq, colonial rule lasts until 1932, when political resistance forces the United Kingdom to leave. To avoid losing all influence over the country, the British fall back on their old tactic of supporting local powers sympathetic to British interests, and install their wartime allies, the Arab Sunni royal family, the Hashemites. This solidifies the British choice to side with Iraq's Sunni minority over the Shia majority. In 1941, the Hashemites are overthrown in a nationalist coup, leading the English to fear they could lose access to crucial Iraqi oil reserves right in the middle of the Second World War. Breaking forces away from the European front, Britain reoccupies Iraq and deposes the new government of Rashid Ali.
The taking of Mosul, which came later, put the Rashid Ali boys out of the picture once and for all. And here go the armored cars in a dash across the desert, entering the now surrendered stronghold.
Once order is restored, Britain again entrusts Iraq to the Hashemites, who are again overthrown in 1958.
Without warning, revolution has swept away the young King Faisal of Iraq and his uncle Crown Prince Abdul Ilah. Iraq becomes #1 danger spot.
Throughout the next decade, the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party rises to prominence, and with it an ambitious young shepherd son with a talent for violence, named Saddam Hussein. By the time the Ba'ath Party seizes power in 1968, Mosul is basking in the never-ending upswing of Middle Eastern oil. It founds the University of Mosul, which becomes a cultural center and a great source of pride. But by the 1970s, the dual Arab-Kurdish city is less diverse than during most of its history. It thrives under Saddam's sectarian Sunni government, providing a huge proportion of his upper-level government and military personnel. But the large Kurdish population means the city also remains a source of political and insurgent efforts by Kurdish separatists. The Tigris River delineates the ethnic divide, with Sunni Arabs on the west of the river, Kurds, Shia Arabs, and small minorities on the east. It's a rich, fractured place, and a desirable prize for Turkey, Iran, and a long-awaited Iraqi Kurdistan. Saddam is able to broker Iraq's oil reserves into extreme wealth and military dominance. But no matter how brutal his tactics become, he cannot permanently put an end to unrest among the Kurdish and Shia Arab populations. Iran arms and funds the Iraqi Kurds, helping them stage repeated uprisings in the face of unspeakable oppression. The situation shifts suddenly in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution brings the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who immediately tries to foster a populist Shia coup against Saddam's Sunni Ba'ath Party, partly to end Iran's aggressive influence and partly to take advantage of a weakened rival on the world stage. Saddam attacks in 1980. The resulting Iran-Iraq war lasts 8 years, killing millions with brutal World War I-era tactics and heavy use of chemical weapons. In particular, Saddam uses chemical weapons against northern Kurdish rebels who fight with Iran. Eventually, he tries to cow the Kurdish and Shia Arab populations within his own borders by turning his weapons of mass destruction on civilians, sparking international outrage, but limited intervention. Mosul, with its large Kurdish population, is on the front lines both figuratively and literally. But its wealth is such that during this time it completes construction of the Saddam Dam, now the Mosul Dam, the fourth largest in the Middle East. When the Iran-Iraq War ends in 1988, both Iraqi and Iranian borders are unchanged. Mosul is standing but burned, tarnished by growing ethnic and sectarian hatreds. Saddam knows Mosul is one of the keys to the Kurdish resistance, and throughout the north his forces murder at least 100,000 Kurdish civilians. Simultaneously putting down large Kurdish and Shia resistance groups and fending off much of the Middle East requires such a large and expensive military that even Iraq's enormous oil economy is eventually pushed to the breaking point. In 1990, Saddam masses much of his force along the border with Kuwait, the tiny southern microstate that is home to almost as much oil as Iraq itself. Saddam invades, and America intervenes by brokering the construction of military bases in Saudi Arabia. These crusader outposts in the Holy Land fuel Islamist anger in the years to come. From these bases, the US initiates the Gulf War, dominating Saddam's forces and pushing them all the way back to Baghdad. The US destroys more than 2/3 of his military capacity, but Saddam takes his toll as well. When the Bush administration stops short of toppling the government, Saddam manages to consolidate power and avoid being overthrown. Frustrated and lacking the political support to do it with American power, Bush calls on the Iraqi people to rise up and depose Saddam. In the north, the Kurds do rise up, but though it does set up a no-fly zone to stop devastating air attacks on Kurdish civilians, the US provides no real assistance to the rebel cause, a grudge many Kurds hold to this day. Saddam's crackdown kills a large fraction of the Kurds in Iraq, but continued uprisings and American air cover eventually force him to accept a de facto autonomous Kurdish region in the north. When the Iraqi army eventually withdraws from Kurdish territory, however, Mosul's large garrison of loyalist soldiers hold their ground. The city is now one of the only major Kurdish populations not within the new semi-autonomous region of Iraqi Kurdistan, which envelops the city on 3 sides. Saddam funds some politically minded Islamic extremists from places like Iran and Saudi Arabia, and allows them to use the Iraqi desert to train for later insurgencies against these international rivals. At the same time, a new ideology emphasizing aggressive, global jihad emerges largely from the conservative Wahhabi Sunnis of Saudi Arabia. Many of these fundamentalist Sunnis go to Afghanistan to join the holy war against the Soviet occupation, and fight under the command of a wealthy and charismatic young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. With Western assistance, the Afghani resistance eventually forces the Soviet Union to withdraw, giving bin Laden his first true glimpse of a way to successfully wage unfettered jihad in a world ruled by global superpowers. This is how Al-Qaeda is born, helping to break a modern global power against an ancient and traditional nation. His new jihadis are natural enemies of Saddam's oppressive, largely secular government. Their adherence to the Wahhabi doctrine means they view Saddam's corrupt Sunni dictatorship as no less blasphemous than a Shia, Christian, or even Jewish state. In any case, throughout the 1990s, Iraq's most dangerous terrorists are all in Saddam's military and cabinet.
Saddam Hussein, bombing, helicopters, destroyed us.
These figures design and implement Iraq's Arabization program, driving many of the smaller minorities like Yazidis and Christians out of Mosul and into the countryside, causing the city to be defined even more strongly by its Arab-Kurd split in demographics. Until the early 2000s, American and coalition aircraft continually patrol Iraqi airspace and frequently bomb anti-air emplacements. Though more than a decade passes between the two Gulf Wars, the American military never truly leaves Iraq. Bin Laden makes repeated attempts to goad America into the sort of large-scale military action that had been so grievously harmful to the Soviets, and eventually, this effort proves successful. As tensions rise after 9/11 and the American invasion of Afghanistan, Saddam lets some Afghan resistance fighters train inside Iraq. But within the US government, the effort is specifically to connect Saddam to Al-Qaeda, and through them, the 9/11 attacks.
But what I want to bring to your attention today is the potentially much more sinister nexus between Iraq and the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda lieutenants.
Zarqawi's presence in Iraq becomes one of the pillars for the US argument for invasion, despite the known fact that this relatively low-level member of Al-Qaeda had only traveled to Iraq upon hearing of a looming US invasion. With international pressure building, Mosul's university and the Al-Kindi military base make it a source of scrutiny for the UN-mandated weapons inspectors. As he does at all such inspection sites, Saddam hides his lack of weapons of mass destruction by giving inspectors only partial access or refusing them entirely. This gives the second Bush administration the final point it needs to convince America of the case for invasion, and this time, the US war machine invades Iraq for real. The Second Gulf War offers no more lasting impediment to the American military than the first. In less than 3 weeks of direct fighting, American forces completely topple Saddam's power base in all areas. Baghdad and the Shia South come under attack mostly from bases in Kuwait, while in the north, Turkish political resistance forces the US to deploy from Iraqi Kurdish territory. The CIA and US Special Forces work with the Kurds and their Peshmerga fighters, leading many Arabs to view the US as a friend to the Kurds above all other Iraqis. US-led forces eventually move into Mosul, and northern Iraq is quickly given over to the command of General David Petraeus and his 101st Airborne Division. Petraeus is an expert in counterinsurgency and nation-building thanks to tours in countries like Bosnia and Haiti. He invests significant time and resources in reopening vital infrastructure, including the University of Mosul, and repairs battered villages surrounding the city.
Where 5 months ago there was nothing but open farmland, now there are 42 homes. There is even a children's choir.
Petraeus tries to work through local hostility, rehabilitating the economy while carrying out hundreds of targeted raids on known insurgents. More controversially, he also employs former Iraqi military commanders and Ba'athist police officers to put an end to violence in the streets. The strategy is at least somewhat successful, leading many to praise Petraeus for getting results. But no general, alone, can offset the catastrophic effects of decisions being made in Baghdad. In May of 2003, the U.S. officially sets up the Coalition Provisional Authority to govern the country during its transition to a new democratic government, and appoints as its leader a former aide to Henry Kissinger named L. Paul Bremer III. Bremer has no combat or wartime experience, but he is a longtime believer in power politics. Accordingly, Coalition Provisional Authority Order No. 1 is entitled The De-Baathification of Iraqi Society. Named and modeled after the denazification of Germany after the Second World War, this involves the systematic purging of anyone with ties to Saddam's Ba'ath Party. It extends from the halls of government down to the universities and even the hospitals, and hits establishment Sunni cities the hardest. Together with unrestrained looting of the ministries in Baghdad, this results in the crippling of the Iraqi government. Following the invasion, Mosul is without basic services for some time. But the enormity of CPA Order No. 1 is only a prelude to CPA Order No. 2, the dissolution of the Iraqi army. In a single day, the CPA makes unemployed 250,000 men with fighting experience, no viable economic future, and a history of combat with Americans.
I'm glad we came down here.
It is widely cited as one of the biggest contributors to the development of a robust resistance within Iraq, swelling the ranks of the previously isolated hardcore of remaining Ba'ath Party loyalists. Shortly after Bremer disbands the army, attacks from Iraqi insurgents begin in earnest.
Whoa! Holy shit!
Unemployment skyrockets further than ever, especially in Sunni areas where military recruiting had been heaviest. Mosul, one of the hearts of Saddam's military complex, is hit hardest of all. Any attempt to rebuild an effective Iraqi military to combat insurgents will now have to start largely from scratch. In July of 2003, Saddam's notorious sons Uday and Qusay Hussein are found and killed in combat near Mosul, where they have been hiding among relatives and other Ba'ath Party loyalists. This deals a harsh blow to the Ba'athist insurgency, but it has no effect on sectarian religious groups or Kurdish fighters who view the chaos of invasion as a chance to carve out a truly independent Kurdish state. Hatreds are kept mostly in check, however, until just before the new year, when U.S. forces find Saddam hiding in a bunker near Tikrit.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
The war against Saddam is finally over, but Iraq seems no more governable than before. In 2004, Petraeus and the 101st Airborne are replaced in northern Iraq by a single brigade with no command experience in counterinsurgency. Their Stryker combat vehicles are intimidating and aloof as they roam the hostile city, engaging in sporadic firefights throughout the day and night before rolling directly back to a secluded forward operating base. In general, these U.S. forces have virtually no peaceful interaction with local Sunnis, and begin to back their existing Kurdish allies almost exclusively. This creates further resentment in the Sunni-majority city, even as the CPA struggles to get Baghdad and Shia Iraq back in working order. With the rule of law breaking down across the country, the coalition is desperate for willing and experienced police commanders. Washington backs a number of controversial appointees, including an ex-Republican Guard commander named Mehdi Gharawi. Gharawi is one of the only Shia commanders who managed to work his way to a position of power within Saddam's feared Sunni First military unit, and when he's given command of a division of the National Police, he goes about enforcing the will of the state in the only way he knows. During this time, his forces are responsible for beatings, kidnappings, torture, and murder. He is also accused of using his unit as a front for brutal Shia militias in the area. Mosul, along with the southern city of Fallujah, is a center for insurgent forces, but Fallujah is seen as the bigger threat after high-profile killings of private military contractors in November of 2004. The U.S. deploys troops to Fallujah from Mosul, which then immediately comes under attack itself. Left with mostly Iraqi army and police forces to defend the city, up to 3,200 of the city's 4,000 police officers either desert or join the insurgents during the attacks. Dealing with uprisings in two cities, it takes the U.S. and Iraqi forces days of fighting to reclaim nominal control over Mosul, and the northern section of the city remains a source of insurgency for several months, including a devastating suicide attack on a coalition mess tent.
Mosul's become insurgent central in Iraq, al-Qaeda's base of money and foreign fighters. In recent weeks, much of Iraq, especially Baghdad, is quieter, safer. Insurgents have cut and run. Not in Mosul. 5,000 U.S. troops sweep a city of almost 2 million scared people.
During these months, Mosul's infrastructure again collapses, and until order is restored, it is left without police or government, lapsing into widespread humanitarian crisis. The incident becomes known as the Battle of Mosul, and it is the blueprint for even more important battles still to come.
All these guys wearing all black, a couple dozen on each side of the street, on rooftops, alleys, edge of buildings, out of windows, everywhere, started unloading on us. AK fire and multiple RPGs were flying at us from every single direction. IEDs were being ignited on both sides of the street.
The military sophistication and incredible violence displayed by the extremists in their brief foray into Mosul becomes a hallmark of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and in particular its leader, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Now armed with years of experience, Zarqawi has made common cause between his jihadis and the Baathists fighting under Saddam's old second-in-command. With the help of Baathist generals leading experienced soldiers from the disbanded Iraqi army, this new branch of al-Qaeda becomes resilient to U.S. counterinsurgency measures. However strong, Zarqawi's AQI breaks with the global al-Qaeda leadership by carrying out frequent acts of sectarian terrorism against Shia Muslims in addition to their anti-Western attacks. The global leadership of al-Qaeda wants Zarqawi to attack coalition forces, however, and turn Iraq into a quagmire until Western troops withdraw. But Zarqawi's bloodlust will not be restrained, and as the early years of the occupation wear on, once peaceful cities are rocked by hundreds and eventually thousands of car bombs in civilian neighborhoods. The practice of releasing gory execution videos takes root at this point, terrifying and radicalizing the population. Zarqawi's insurgency particularly targets Shia holy sites, including the Great Mosque in Samarra, one of the holiest places in all of Shia Islam. This attack comes to define the most effective extremist recruiting strategy, setting off weeks of Shia reprisals that kill thousands of Sunnis and drive thousands more into the hands of al-Qaeda. In spite of widespread threats from jihadis and anti-coalition insurgents, Iraq hosts two contentious elections in 2005, each with extremely high participation. Though the Sunni minority still feels it has been excluded from real input, eventually power shifts to a shaky political coalition headed by a little-known Shia dissident named Nouri al-Maliki. Though the main goal of de-Baathification is to end sectarian discrimination in the government, Maliki has been a sectarian all his life, He spent the majority of his adult years in exile, hiding in the Shia states of Iran and Syria and working to have Saddam overthrown. After the U.S. deposed Saddam's Sunni-led government, Maliki returned to Baghdad to be a part of the new Shia-first alternative. As one of the few Shia choices palatable to the Americans and other international forces, Maliki is handed power. The same month, the public learns of a secret government prison in Baghdad run by Gaddafi, and sees evidence of the mental and physical abuse of over 1,000 prisoners, most of them Sunnis. Despite frequent calls from President Bush himself, Maliki continues to privilege loyal sectarians while excluding the country's Sunni minority from most positions of power. Due to his time in Tehran and his anti-Sunni behavior, Maliki comes to be seen as a pawn of Iran, which is also funding southern Shia militias throughout this period. The Shia nation wants to use Iraq as a buffer of casualties to prevent what it sees as a looming U.S. invasion of Iran itself. But its serial meddling in Baghdad, coupled with the sectarian violence of its allied militias, ends up playing into al-Qaeda's hands by creating resentment among northern Sunnis and throwing a wrench into both Iranian and U.S. plans for the region. Then, a great victory. Zarqawi is killed in a U.S. airstrike, likely targeted thanks to a tip from within al-Qaeda itself.
Now Zarqawi has met his end, and this violent man will never murder again.
But as Zarqawi's chosen lieutenants now move up the chain of command and come to run AQI, they prove just as disloyal to bin Laden's strategic commands and just as thirsty for the blood of non-Sunnis. AQI goes through several successive changes in identity and leadership, but as the disciples of Zarqawi begin to remake the Iraqi jihad in their own image, al-Qaeda in Iraq starts to truly become what we now know as ISIS. One of the most prominent post-Zarqawi commanders goes by the name Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and over the next several years he comes to control the ever-shifting community of Iraqi extremists. True to Zarqawi's legacy, the nascent Islamic State believes in undermining government and coalition rule primarily by sowing chaos and discord in the country as a whole. The ultimate goal of Baghdadi and those like him is to establish the final Islamic emirate. But the proximate goal is to start a nationwide religious civil war. By 2007, Mosul is ruled at the level of the neighborhood. Kurdish Peshmerga protect most of the eastern neighborhoods, while Sunni insurgents, including al-Qaeda, both protect and exploit many in the west. Government and coalition control is patchy, but David Petraeus, working all the way back in Washington, has one final contribution to make to Mosul's future: the U.S. troop surge. The campaign generally begins in the south of Iraq, so as the 20,000-man influx of U.S. troops pushes the insurgency north, Mosul becomes one of many sites of intensifying violence. What had been a major center for rebel activity becomes the center, and the U.S. begins to try its new strategy of living among the Iraqis to lessen the chaos in the streets, just as insurgent violence against U.S. and Iraqi forces reaches an all-time high.
The surge, we recognize you have to secure the people. The prize is the people. The decisive terrain is the human terrain, and you must secure it. But you can only secure it by living with the people. And that started the moment after I took the colors of the organization and the change of command and made first remarks, and the emphasis was on securing the people. I put out a letter to all of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and civilians of multinational force Iraq that day, securing the people. I changed the mission statement without asking my higher headquarters. Hey, we were in, I thought it was my last job in uniform, and I acted that way.
During the height of the surge, losing hundreds of Americans every month, Petraeus makes a controversial move. He uses U.S. military funds to pay certain of the Sunni insurgent groups to become local police forces allied against al-Qaeda which has alienated even fellow Sunni Islamists with its wanton level of violence.
10, 20, 30, 40,000.
Giving him 10,905,000.
The move is controversial to say the least, sparking a minor uprising among Petraeus's upper ranks.
I said, something just occurred to me. How did you break the news to President Bush that you were going to put the Sunni insurgency on the payroll? General Petraeus kind of looked at me and he said, I didn't. I said, you had a phone conversation with him once a week for an hour. You didn't bother to mention this, probably the most significant policy move in the war? He said, no, it was within my existing authorities. You want audacity, that's audacity.
After several attempts at English language branding, including concerned local citizens and very worried Iraqis, the groups are eventually named the Sons of Iraq. Though the move is widely criticized on ethical and strategic grounds, after months of escalating combat with surge troops, the situation turns. Al-Qaeda's core strategy of attacking then disappearing into the population no longer works in many cases, and with few places left to hide, most extremists are eventually killed, captured, or forced to retreat into Pakistan and Afghanistan. Over the next several years, violence decreases slowly but steadily across Iraq. Immediately after election, the Obama administration sharply changes this American approach. The new president is deeply skeptical of the ability of military power to ever fix a situation like Iraq, and he becomes stuck between the responsibility Bush foisted on America to keep Iraq from devolving into total chaos and his belief that America could easily become endlessly stuck in the quagmire of Middle Eastern politics. Obama is frustrated with seemingly endless calls to await a more effective Iraqi military to take over for U.S. patrols and wants to end the war as he had promised he would while campaigning. Despite warnings from top military commanders that troops had years of work still to do to create a sustainable peace, Obama announces a timeline for U.S. troop withdrawal.
And that is exactly what we are doing, as promised and on schedule.
He believes that America must extricate itself from Iraq, and that the process will only become more painful as time passes.
We cannot do for them what they are unwilling to do for themselves. We can do it temporarily. That's essentially what the U.S. military did after 2006, 2007 in Iraq. Our military is so capable that if we put everything we have into it, we can keep a lid on a problem for a time. But for a society to function long-term, the people and their leaders have to hold themselves accountable for changing those cultures.
The hope is that without American power to prop up a dysfunctional system, Iraq will be forced to become less sectarian in the government and military, or fail utterly. But to troops on the ground, the newly rebuilt Iraqi army seems almost comically unprepared for the task before them.
1, 2, 3, son. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
With such a large and dedicated insurgent community, Mosul particularly exemplifies this problem.
Mosul's got two elements of two Iraqi divisions, Iraqi army divisions. We do not have Iraqi police primacy in Mosul yet because the Iraqi police strength is not sufficient.
To Maliki, this is the main implication of the U.S. timeline. He is now sure to lose access to American power before the country is truly secured. Fearing the Islamists and other challengers, Maliki greatly steps up his use of force. There are violent clashes with Kurdish and Sunni protesters, and Maliki begins more aggressively purging non-loyalists from all levels of the government and military.
Do not tell me it is a national issue, because it is clear that it is a rotten one. It has rotten slogans and is accompanied by rotten practices. I am not concerned because it is only hot air. It will come to an end. We tell them to stop before being forced to stop by the government. Your voices have been heard and enough is enough.
In Baghdad, a court finally charges Garawi for his command of the illegal government prison, but the Shia commander is too useful to Maliki to simply throw away. After several years of stalling, and over the strong objections of the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, the government officially refuses to arrest him. A year later, as the last U.S. troops prepare to leave, Maliki appoints Garawi to command the National Police Force in Mosul. A Shia sectarian butcher is now in charge of protecting and pacifying the largest Sunni-majority city in the country, the last truly intractable source of the insurgency, and the biggest Kurdish population not within Kurdish control. When the last US troops leave in December of 2011, Maliki signals the true return of tactics familiar to Iraqis by issuing an arrest warrant for his Sunni vice president and rival, Tariq al-Hashimi. The Iraqi military's effectiveness is continually degraded by sectarian promotions and culls, and Garawi's increasingly brittle Mosul Defense Force is faced with policing an increasingly hostile population. Large numbers of Sunnis begin turning up dead in the streets, dumped as examples to anyone thinking of supporting al-Qaeda. And just then, at the height of the uncertainty for Mosul's future, the Syrian civil war breaks out along Iraq's northwestern border. The global leadership of al-Qaeda, including Baghdadi in Iraq, decides to dispatch a force to exploit the chaos. They call it the Nusra Front, and while US forces have battered al-Qaeda into a temporary defeat in Iraq, this new Syrian affiliate finds enormous success in the dispossessed Sunnis of eastern Syria. Much like the oppressed Shia majority of Saddam's Iraq, Syria's Sunni majority has long been excluded and oppressed by the sectarian government of Bashar al-Assad. The extremists take the ancient Sunni city of Raqqa, home to almost 250,000 people, and quickly come to hold widespread, if deserted, territory well across the Iraqi border. In part because of their success, the Syrian extremists begin to fracture at this point. ISIS believes it is entitled to an ancient area encompassing most of Iraq, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, and Baghdadi's troops fight intermittently with those loyal to the global al-Qaeda leadership and nationalist Syrian jihadis, both of whom take offense at Baghdadi's audacity in declaring the Nusra Front under ISIS control. During this time, ISIS scores a number of crucial wins. As Assad comes down harder on largely secular rebel forces, those rebels increasingly seek help from the United States, or anyone else who can give a fighting chance to their totally outmatched force of former civilians. When America proves unwilling to intervene, with chemical weapons falling regularly on civilian neighborhoods, they turn to the only group both willing and able to help: the hardcore of experience and weaponry in the Nusra Front. Perversely, this actually helps Assad's image around the world, and in one incredibly successful move, the Syrian dictator deliberately strengthens the extremist element within the opposition to his government by releasing a large number of jihadis from Syria's prisons. These seasoned fighters quickly join the local anti-government chapter, strengthening Assad's claim that he is primarily fighting a coup by radical Islamists. This narrative invalidating the Syrian opposition is so successful that when Assad drops deadly sarin gas on a civilian neighborhood in the Ghouta countryside, the world hesitates as it actually considers the possibility that the rebels gassed themselves for the international sympathy. The US, along with the rest of the Western world, is paralyzed by conflicting priorities, while Assad and the jihadis do everything they can to accelerate Syria's wild spiral into anarchy.
What about barrel bombs? You don't deny that your forces use them.
I know about the army. They use bullets, missiles, and bombs. I haven't heard of army using barrels or maybe cooking pots.
Large barrels full of explosives and projectiles which are dropped from helicopters and explode with devastating effect. There's been a lot of testimony about these things.
They're called bombs. We have bombs, missiles, and bullets.
So you wouldn't deny that included under the category of bombs are these barrel bombs, which are indiscriminate weapons?
No, there's no indiscriminate weapons. When you shoot, you aim. And when you aim at terrorists in order to protect civilians. Again, if you're talking about casualty, that's war. You cannot have war without casualty.
There are always casualties in war, and civilians die as well, but it is the responsibility under international humanitarian law for belligerents on both sides to do everything they can to protect civilians. And the accusation against the Syrian army is that by using barrel bombs, indiscriminate weapons, and Stefan de Mistura, again, the UN envoy, he's talked about the constant fear of barrel bombs, means that you are not respecting humanitarian law by protecting your own people. What do you say to that?
First of all, we've been attacked in Damascus and in Aleppo. We've been attacked by the rebels, not vice versa. They've been attacking the Syrian with mortars. So you have to retaliate and defend your people.
Assad's horrific crimes spur thousands of idealistic Muslims from around the world to go to Syria to fight for their oppressed Sunni brothers. But when they arrive, they find the resistance dominated by extremists. Many are quickly radicalized and end up fighting for ISIS all over the Middle East, including in Iraq. Nusra's appeal to the moderate rebels comes from their combat experience, organization, and above all, their ability to make money.
They were self-sustaining financially. They had kidnapping. They had extortion. They're kind of like a criminal syndicate. They have real estate. They would get control over homes in Mosul and go to the government and say, we're selling this, and demand the profits.
The Syrian resistance, meanwhile, provides the extremists a seemingly endless supply of recruits in return. These new recruits allow ISIS to stage a daring attack on Abu Ghraib prison, mere kilometers from Baghdad itself, releasing over 500 inmates, most of them veterans of the insurgency. Among those released is Abdul Rahman Bilawi, a Saddam loyalist who will go on to become the ISIS military chief for all of Iraq. Many of the other prisoners have harrowing tales of abuse at the hands of American soldiers and interrogators. Much of the physical abuse is tame relative to what Iraq has seen in the past, but stories and images of religious and personal shaming drive many young Muslims into the hands of the Islamic State. By the end of this rapid expansion, combined Nusra-ISIS territory comes dangerously close to Mosul, but the extremists are still too weak to consider attacking directly. The ISIS advance is so alarming that Maliki heads to Washington to personally request more direct military assistance. Short of some extra missiles and vehicles, however, the Obama administration refuses to re-engage American power.
You know, it's been 2 years since the last U.S. troops left from Iraq.
مضى سنتين على مغادرة آخر الجنود الأمريكيين للعراق.
But the strategic partnership between our two countries remains very strong.
ولكن الشراكة الاستراتيجية الثنائية بين البلدين لا تزال قوية جدا.
We honor the lives that were lost, both American and Iraqi, to bring about a functioning democracy in a country that previously...
When he returns to Iraq, Maliki yet again increases his use of force, arresting parliamentary rivals and provoking violent clashes with police. One particular clash in Hawija becomes a massacre, killing hundreds and finally destroying any hope of a united Iraq under Maliki. The result of this attempt to pacify the Sunni population is a widespread Sunni uprising. And just as Maliki's brutal and inept national forces struggle with a raging population, ISIS attacks. By the end of their months-long offensive, it's June of 2014, and the black flag of al-Qaeda now flies over a wide swath of the Middle East. With major bases in Raqqa in Syria and Fallujah in Iraq, ISIS starts to become a household name around the world. The fall of Fallujah is particularly biting to the Americans who fought so intensely for the city just a few years before. ISIS territory now stretches dangerously close to Mosul's outskirts and its lucrative oil fields. In the middle of this ISIS advance and the larger Sunni awakening, Gaddawi's Shia National Police Force only clamps down harder. Gaddawi's force in Mosul opens fire on peaceful protesters, and his troops are credibly accused of murdering 5 locals in cold blood, including a 15-year-old boy. Gaddawi believes the extremists view Mosul as their emirate, their home turf. He fully expects an attack, and brutality with the Sunnis he sees as the allies of al-Qaeda is his only method of prevention. Rather than reprimand his lieutenant for fostering further chaos in the Sunni city, Maliki rewards Gaddawi by making him operational commander for all of Nineveh province. Over the first half of 2014, Kurdish intelligence comes to the Iraqi army with a tip. Jihadis are massing near the Syrian border, and there are rumors of a coming large-scale attack on Mosul. Gaddawi replicates this warning with his own intelligence, gathered from several ISIS sleeper agents captured in the city itself. They've been slowly cutting the city off from crucial supplies, including the destruction of several bridges, and intelligence suggests their move into the city's underworld of organized crime is bringing in millions per month. Gaddawi's requests for a larger city defense force fall on deaf ears, however. In Baghdad, the assumption is that the jihadis could never take Mosul, and if they did, they could be driven out quickly, just like last time.
I fired and fired and fired and fired and fired at everything.
Immediately before the attack, ISIS sees the situation much the same way. The plan is to set out for Mosul in a lightning-fast convoy of pickup trucks, with suicide bombings softening the city for a quick, strategic attack. The goal is to take portions of the city long enough to liberate jihadis from the local prisons. What they can't know is how profoundly Gaddawi's security force has been diminished by cuts, corruption, and incompetence, and that their own fearsome reputation has taken a strong hold among the Iraqi security forces. Many soldiers pay a third or half of their salary to their commander in exchange for staying home, allegedly accounting for as many as half of the budgeted defenders. There should be several thousand defenders from the Iraqi Army's 3rd Division alone, and close to 25,000 including police. By some reports, in reality this combined force numbers fewer than 10,000. And while Mosul is a storage site for a huge cache of American weapons left over after withdrawal, most of the defenders are poorly armed and outfitted. This is the force tasked with protecting a city of almost 2 million people, most of whom view them as violent, foreign-backed oppressors. On June 4th, Gaddawi's forces find and corner Bilawi just outside of Mosul. He blows himself up to avoid capture, but searches of his home turn up documents that reveal the entire upper structure of ISIS. The hope is that the loss of such a figure and his intelligence will delay any plans for an attack, but ISIS artillery begins shelling some northern areas the next day. All efforts at prevention have failed, and on June 6, 2014, the attack begins. Suicide trucks hit the city's outer defenses, followed quickly by several hundred fighters in Humvees and pickups. They have small arms, RPGs, and large-caliber mounted machine guns, making them better armed than the Iraqi military units they are facing. As they carry out their plan to take and hold a few important eastern neighborhoods, they begin to execute captured police and army personnel by hanging, or burning, or crucifixion. Some display the bodies on the hoods of their trucks, which are greeted warmly by many Sunni residents in these eastern areas. Planned by Bilawi and coordinated by his fellow ex-Ba'athist commanders from Saddam's army, The offensive is more successful than the extremists could have dreamed, and as the Iraqi force begins to fall back, excited ISIS commanders realize they could take far more than the local prison. They call for reinforcements from the Syrian arm of the extremist force, pulling from a pool of Nusra fighters that did not exist 2 years before. As the sun sets on June 6th, the city's fate is far from assured. The next day, seeing the potential for a complete ISIS takeover of Mosul, the Kurds come to Maliki to offer assistance. He refuses their military help, twice, presumably fearing it could one day be difficult to get rid of Peshmerga forces that had dug into the city militarily. Without these crucial reinforcements, Ghadawi's forces are forced to fall back throughout the second day of the battle. The rate of the advance skyrockets on June 8th, however, with the arrival of the Syrian reinforcements. More than 100 additional vehicles, carrying at least 400 fighters. At the same time, ISIS activates sleeper cells throughout the city. These local Sunni and Ba'athist loyalist groups attack local security forces from among their assigned populations, just as a renewed ISIS force attacks the front with astonishing ferocity. In the face of this assault, and with no connection to their increasingly hostile charges, Ghadawi's force collapses. Their commanders are largely incompetent patronage appointees who misuse what resources they do have, and huge numbers of troops turn and run without firing a shot. The extremists take Badash prison, freeing hundreds more inmates to help secure the city. The people are rising up for ISIS, many of them from Petraeus' Sons of Iraq. Previously at war with al-Qaeda, the rebel groups have come to view the sectarian oppression of Maliki's Shia forces as the greater threat. The city Petraeus once held up as the model for managing the rest of Iraq has now become the world's most important center for terror. On June 9th, the extremists end the battle. An enormous truck-borne bomb finishes a dramatic last stand by Iraqi security forces at an abandoned hotel. The city's highest commanders are soon seen retreating across the Tigris and eventually leaving the city. And Ghadawi himself makes a desperate escape under heavy fire. After this, every remaining member of the security forces either joins the jihadis or discards his uniform, burns his camp, and runs for the hills.
Можете посмотреть вот с той стороны. Братья начали нападение. И в той области шли бои 3 дня. 3 дня 200 муджахидов сопротивлялись большому, огромному количеству иракских войск, подготовленных американскими спецслужбами и проспонсированных американцами. И после очень сложных и длительных боев, через 3 дня вот в этом месте была произведена Амалия Истишхадия, или, как говорят иракцы, догма. Здесь был взорван генерал Муртадов, который приехал проверять один из своих КПП. И после этой Амалии Истишхадии Муртады, Аллах вселил им огромный страх, и братья начали атаку с этой стороны, и вплоть до другой части города, на этом берегу, они гнали этих муртадов, и они бежали, и бросали свое оружие и одежду, все это вы видели. Потом, на следующее утро, на другой части города, на соседнем берегу, они полностью очистили все свои базы, побросали все, и, хвала Аллаху, отдали этот замечательный город в руки муджахидов исламского государства. Альхамдулилля.
Mosul is the biggest power center ever acquired by a terrorist group, and ISIS treats it accordingly. Over the next few days, fighters pour into the city and secure it beyond any hope of recapture by the Iraqi army alone. More than a quarter of the city, at least 500,000 people, are forced to flee, and the Kurds in particular make heroic efforts to take in the displaced families.
طلعنا بالثلاث من العالم كلها من ال 12 هي مستلمينها يعني الرب.
والله من الخطاب مال المالكي يهدد انه حيرمي الموصل بالطيارات.
This woman tells me the jihadis told people they had nothing to fear from them. We left because of al-Maliki, the prime minister, she says. He's going to bombard Mosul using warplanes.
Even without these citizens, Mosul is by far the largest extremist victory the world has ever seen. In 2014, its population is significantly larger than all other ISIS-controlled cities combined. In taking Mosul, the already surging ISIS force captures billions of dollars in cash, oil, and oil reserves to finance their wars, and the second largest cache of US-made weapons and equipment in the country. Their loot includes tens of thousands of small arms, thousands of Humvees and armored vehicles, significant numbers of anti-tank and anti-aircraft systems, artillery including more than 50 howitzers, and even M1A1 tanks. Elated, the extremists push on, and armed with the most advanced weaponry in the region outside of Israel, they continue their rampage through northern and even into southern Iraq. The Iraqi army garrison in nearby Kirkuk abandons the city before ISIS even arrives, but with the city now ripe for the taking, the Kurds seize the opportunity to annex a city they see as rightfully theirs. Peshmerga forces move into the city, securing it from both the extremists and the Iraqi government that ostensibly rules it.
And when the Iraqi army abandoned this base, Kurdish Peshmerga soldiers, highly professional, highly trained, about 1,500 of them, they took over this army base, and they're not giving it back.
The Kurds look out over the desert at Mosul and dream of one day taking this last missing piece in their quickly forming Iraqi state. Taking Mosul puts the Islamic State in the center of the public eye.
What the is going on over there? How are the militants moving so quickly?
And in the weeks that follow, Baghdadi uses the city as the stage for his next great move. He holds an unprecedented sermon in broad daylight at the city's great mosque, announcing the formation of the final Islamic State and pronouncing himself its caliph. From this well-known pulpit, with his face in full view, Baghdadi declares war on the world.
من كفر بعد ذلك فأولئك هم الفاسقون وإن أردتم موعود الله فجاهدوا في سبيل الله وحرضوا المؤمنين واصبروا على تلك المشقة.
The powerful implication is that he is speaking from within the secured borders of a true Islamic State. He calls on Muslims everywhere to join the cause, and the drama of the moment launches this call to enormous prominence. Tens of thousands answer, allowing the group to push its agenda in Iraq and continue to destabilize Syria. And, now secure in its well-fortified cities, ISIS can dispatch some of its most effective commanders to lead sizable but disorganized insurgent communities in places like Libya, Egypt, and Yemen. Like Zarqawi before them, these Islamic State commanders understand the power of chaos and the outsized role they can play in any area with long-simmering local tensions. They also uphold Zarqawi's legacy by continuing to refuse the larger al-Qaeda strategy of seeking alliances with local populations. The people of Mosul witnessed this inherent falseness to the Islamic State's ideology more clearly than anyone. To clear Badash prison, ISIS fighters release Sunni inmates, both jihadis and other criminals, but hundreds of other Shia and minority inmates are slaughtered to clear their cells. Many jihadis operate as simple thugs, while others oppress fellow Sunnis for following a different or less stringent version of the religion. Islamic State spiritual authorities recognize the necessity of appeasing their largely rabid base of fighters and regularly produce new religious interpretations designed to allow theft, murder, and particularly rape of whole populations of people. Incompetence and the skewed priorities of total war lead to a breakdown in basic services, while many jihadi soldiers focus solely on wanton destruction. Within a month of Baghdadi's speech, the Islamic State dynamites several major cultural and religious sites around the city, including ancient historical grounds and the tomb of the biblical Jonah. When it announces a plan to destroy one of the city's most iconic structures, the great leaning minaret at the same mosque that had just hosted Baghdadi's famous sermon, dozens of citizens form a human wall to protect it. Over the next several months, Islamic State fighters destroy hundreds of priceless artifacts and steal many others to sell on the black market. They also kill or drive out thousands of minorities, particularly Yazidis and Christians, remaking the population of their new Iraqi capital in their own image. Their Wahhabi sect of Sunni Islam was regressive even when it was founded several hundred years before. Now, in 2014, ISIS begins to try to enforce the laws and social structures of 7th century Arabia on a diverse, modern city. From multiple mandatory daily prayers to edicts completely banning all forms of music, the attempt does not go smoothly. Public executions are daily occurrences. One day, they throw an accused homosexual from the roof of a tall building. The next, they burn several Yazidi women alive for refusing to have sex with ISIS fighters. Even Sunni Arab women experience incredible oppression and have virtually no freedom in this new caliphate.
We are afraid to even go out, says this woman, who must wear a veil and be accompanied by a male relative. The best freedom is to stay inside your house. We have known true Islam for years, but we have never seen anything like this.
Sex slaves from minorities deemed unworthy of human rights become an accepted part of the compensation provided to any ISIS fighter who desires one. Badash prison becomes a living nightmare for hundreds of Yazidi women who are kept and serially assaulted until they convert to the Wahhabi religion. Those who do are sold off as wives to ISIS fighters. In all, ISIS manages to turn the people of Mosul against them even more quickly than Maliki. A small but extremely dedicated multi-ethnic resistance force emerges within a matter of months, calling itself the Mosul Battalions.
Kidnapped. Official from Islamic State grabbed from the streets of Mosul, where a small resistance movement is fighting back. These are the first images to emerge of the Mosul brigades, mostly Sunni Arabs, who are taking on Islamic State in the biggest city under its control.
Facing such opposition, priority number one for the extremists is to find a way to sell their newfound riches in oil. And soon enough, countries like Turkey, Russia, and even Assad's Syrian government are accused of purchasing this cheap, bloody oil on the black market, even while opposing the group on other fronts. All that's ever proved, however, is that someone is buying ISIS energy products. In August, the riches and weaponry captured in Mosul allow the Islamic State to take its apocalyptic agenda to all new places, namely into Kurdish territory in both Iraq and Syria. It takes the enormous Mosul Dam, disrupting repairs on a structure in such poor condition that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers once described it as the most dangerous dam in the world. If it breaks, estimates say over 1 million people could die, from Mosul down to Baghdad, with millions more displaced. The extremists also take valuable oil fields and begin to approach Erbil, a city of more than 1.5 million Kurds. They also demolish huge swaths of the Iraqi-Syrian border in an attempt to undo the European Sykes-Picot Agreement that fractured the Muslim world after the First World War.
For there is no honor to be found in the remnants of shirk and nationalism.
It's the threat to Erbil that prompts the Obama administration to act to protect the city's sizable American population and enormous level of American investment.
an encroachment close enough to Erbil, it would justify us taking shots, just for pure protection of U.S. personnel and facilities.
The U.S. begins openly arming the Kurds and carries out airstrikes on Islamic State targets, with a particular effort to destroy captured American armor. The spread into Kurdistan slows, but the momentum of the jihadis is far from broken. During this time, the Islamic State also takes the small Yazidi town of Sinjar and perpetrates a massacre of thousands. More than 40,000 of the survivors are driven into the Sinjar mountains, trapped without food or water. The plan is to starve them to death, but Iraqi and coalition aid keeps them alive while airstrikes slowly weaken the extremist force waiting below.
Wolf, I've been doing this job for more than 10 years. I have never seen a situation as desperate as emotionally charged as this, and I've never seen a rescue effort as ad hoc and as improvised as this. I think we were all crying on our flight back from there, and I can say that these men were able to save about 60 people today, but there are still, the Kurdish commander here says, tens of thousands of people still trapped on that mountain, about 45 minutes flight from where I am right now.
It is this attempted Yazidi genocide as much as anything else that spurs larger international intervention. Shortly after the incident, Canada, the UK, France, Australia, Germany, Turkey, Italy, Poland, and Denmark all sign on to lend military support.
مريرا يعيش هنا يزيديون الآن في جبل سنجار. سيد الرئيس، نذبح تحت يافطة لا إله إلا الله. سيد الرئيس، لحد الآن 500 شاب ورجل يزيدي ذبحوا.
السيدة النائبة، التزمي بالبيان الذي وافقت عليه.
سيد الرئيس، نساؤنا تسبى وتباع في سوق الرق. رجاء أخوان.
Maliki is fiercely protecting his hold on power throughout this period. He blames Gharawi for Mosul's loss and tries to bring him up on charges for abandoning his post during the attack. Before the trial can go forward, however, the U.S. says that further military support would come only if Maliki steps aside. He finally does.
ولتسهيل سير العملية السياسية وتشكيل الحكومة الجديدة سحب ترشيحي لصالح الأخ الدكتور حيدر العبادي وكل ما يترتب على ذلك حفاظا على المصالح العليا للبلاد.
Maliki's replacement, a relative moderate named Abadi, must now go about the slow, painful process of undoing the corruption and sectarian discrimination in the government and military, and he has to do it while fending off the surging Islamic State. Empowered by the public outrage at a litany of grisly ISIS execution videos, and eventually terrorist attacks in the West, Obama and his coalition make this quest easier by opening up the bombing war. Training personnel embed with the Iraqi army, but coalition troops avoid direct combat. As 2014 draws to a close, the Allied nations begin to carry out the style of sustained, distant killing not seen in Iraq since the first Gulf War.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
Over the course of 2015, the Islamic State's sprawling territorial gains begin to fall apart. Combat with Iraqi forces and sustained coalition airstrikes bring their fighting force from almost 35,000 to under 20,000, while strategic operations against banks, oil supplies, and cash transfers cripple their ability to pay and equip their forces. Al-Qaeda has at times disavowed and declared war on ISIS for its slaughter of fellow Muslims, and the Syrian nationalists in the Nusra Front continue to resist Baghdadi's attempts to assert Islamic State control over the extremists in both countries. The Shia Ayatollah Sistani, the most powerful religious leader in Iraq, declares a fatwa against the Islamic State in the weeks after Mosul's fall, greatly invigorating war-weary southern Iraqis. The brutality of both sides of the Syrian civil war provides the Nusra Front ample fuel for its hatred-based ideology, but in Iraq, even most conservative Sunnis have given up trying to live alongside the jihadis. Their terrifying lightning war strategy has backfired. Now, the fearsome reputation of the Islamic State drives the world to join forces and stamp them from existence.
Then there's your new coalition of devils, with Iran, Turkey, and Russia joining the fray. That's because the Millah of Kufr will always unite you together to fight the truth. So bring it on, all of you. Your numbers only increase us in faith, and we're counting your banners, which our prophet said would reach 80 in number. And then the flames of war will finally burn you on the hills of death.
The international crackdown also has self-interested motivations, as helping to fight the Islamic State has given forces loyal to Iran, Turkey, Kurdistan, and other nearby powers an excuse to surround the city. Iran, long the only major Shia power in the world, spends enormous amounts of money and influence to direct the political tides in the new Shia-run Iraqi government. Iran is desperate to form a multinational Shia front against their Sunni arch-rivals in Saudi Arabia. The Shia militias that support the Iraqi army are staffed mostly by idealistic young believers following the Ayatollah Sistani's call, but a hefty portion of undercover Iranian agents taint these militias in the eyes of northern Sunnis. To allow coordination with the Mosul battalions inside Mosul itself, and to avoid a possible Iranian or Kurdish annexation, the US wants Iraq to raise a strong force of Sunni fighters to take back the city. But every day they hold back and wait for that force to materialize is a day Mosul remains under the yoke of the Islamic State. With ISIS thus largely contained, endless combat and airstrikes from coalition forces have forced the jihadis to increasingly abandon the core conceit of ISIS: a safe, independent nation for terrorists. Now, the group is by necessity reverting to many of the global guerrilla tactics of al-Qaeda.
They're becoming more savvy in the use of electronic devices. They don't fly flags and move around in large convoys the way they did. They don't establish headquarters that are visible or identifiable.
Despite this attempt to turn back to the people for cover, ISIS's total lack of al-Qaeda's ability to form alliances has left its fighters in Mosul beset on all sides, just like Qarawi before them. Their response to this pressure has been predictable: a wave of bombings in Baghdad, multiple times daily murders of Shia civilians, designed to drum up sectarian hatred for Iraq's Sunnis and perpetuate the violence and chaos that feeds its apocalyptic ideology. As Mosul slowly fell to the Islamic State, widespread reports indicate that on multiple occasions the defending Iraqi army opened fire on the city's Sunni civilian population. In the heat of battle, with a grisly death approaching from within their own charges, the soldiers had branded them all al-Qaeda. The result was a backlash that echoed decades of violence in Iraq and hastened the fall of a major city to fewer than 1,000 lightly armed marauders. This is the core strategic insight of ISIS, adapted from bin Laden's epiphany in creating the al-Qaeda model. Groups that feed off of chaos seemingly incur no penalty for having created that chaos themselves. From the American invasion of Afghanistan to the worsening of the Syrian civil war, modern jihadis simultaneously require the use of military force and thrive off its least avoidable side effects. The new Iraqi government of Abadi claims to have learned this lesson, attacking ISIS without mercy while advocating a measured reintegration of Iraq's Sunni population. In Baghdad, calls for full representation for Sunni Arabs are punctuated by Sunni car bombs in Shia neighborhoods. Only the freshness of the ISIS trauma has kept Iraq's majority population from responding with the familiar crackdowns and knee-jerk brutality toward blameless populations. But the extremist gambit is beginning to make progress with opportunistic or reactionary Shia clerics, and as the embattled ISIS force continues to funnel much-needed explosives away from the front and into distant peaceful neighborhoods, the true power of their strategy is being put to the test.
Here's your assigned topic. The American military learned what lessons from Abu Ghraib and what are the strategic implications? Please outline your main headings.
Well, I mean, what they outlined for me is that you have to live your values, and that there's two arguments for living your values, by the way. One is that it's the right thing to do. There'll be some folks that won't buy that, actually, or they'll have a different interpretation of what the right thing to do is. They'll say, well, the enemy doesn't have to do that. You know, maybe we ought to be a little expedient too. And then I would provide the, if you will, the realistic approach, the practical approach, and that is that every time we have taken expedient measures, every time we've had something like Abu Ghraib, which, by the way, that is a non-biodegradable, that is never going away. Those photos are always there. That memory is always present, and every time something like that happens, you suffer from it. You really get bitten in the backside by those kinds of activities. So you must live your values. Again, I believe we should live the values, but again, if someone doesn't buy that, believe the practical reality, and that is if you don't live your values, you're going to pay for it in the long run.